On the 16th of October 1793 in Paris, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, made her slow way to the executioner's scaffold. She was a woman who was hated across her nation, and her husband had lost his head in the months before, and there were many people questioning what to do with the Queen. Marie was a symbol of ridicule and animosity, as she would live a very lavish life whilst the people of her nation were starving and suffering, and Marie did not seem to care one bit. She was accused of a number of serious charges, including treason, and this led to her execution. However, following the guillotine blade falling upon her neck, Marie was hastily buried in a grave in a nearby cemetery, but she would then be exhumed and her coffin was opened. What was found by those who discovered the Queen's remains was shocking. Marie Antoinette was tried by a revolutionary tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and this was a shocking thing, as the Queen of France was being accused of so many serious charges that she could have died. Many of the people in the kingdom believed that she was actually condemned to death when she was brought to her trial, and her lawyers did not have time to gather a decent defence for her. But she was, as mentioned, accused of the most shocking charges, including incest and depletion of the national treasury and sending money to Austria and her homeland, as she was an Austrian princess. She was also said to have been guilty of plotting massacres, and on the 16th of October, 2 days later, she was found guilty of 3 main charges: conspiracy against the security of the state, high treason, and running down the national treasury and the finances of France. Her lawyers never thought that she would be sentenced to death, and they thought she would be sent into exile and banished from ever returning to France. But she was sentenced to death and was condemned, which shocked many. She was then sent to her prison to prepare for her execution, and she did not have a long time to wait. Marie was forced to change into a plain white dress by her guards, and she got dressed in front of their leering eyes, and then her hair was roughly cut short to prevent it snagging in the blade of the guillotine and stopping the execution device making a clean and clear cut on her neck. But she was then led out of her prison cell to an open cart, and she had her arms tied behind her back, and the guards even attached a lead on her like a dog. This cart then slowly processed through Paris and to the Place de la Revolution, which would become her execution site. The people of Paris shouted and jeered at her, and even threw things. The once lavish Queen of France was being taken on the parade of the dead, and it took an hour for the cart to get to the guillotine intended for her. On the final journey, Marie was calm, and she sat with her priest next to her, and she was in a strange mental state, and it's believed she may have just wanted her horrific ordeal and her terrible few years to be over. The former Queen of France arrived at the execution scaffold and the guillotine at 12:15 p.m, and she then climbed down from the cart and was guided up the stairs to the scaffold. She even accidentally stood on the foot of the executioner, and this prompted her final words, which were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." The executioner then placed her on the wooden board, which was then slid under the guillotine blade. Final checks were made, and the executioner then released the blade, and in one swift cut, Marie Antoinette's head was taken clean off. It was then picked up by the executioner, who showed it to the crowd, and one painting even shows how it may have been paraded by the executioner on a pike. But her remains were quickly collected, including her head, and these were taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a short distance away. She was to be buried in an unmarked grave with no pomp and ceremony, but at some point Marie Antoinette's head was moulded by Madame Tussaud. However, Marie Antoinette's head and body were buried inside of the Madeleine Cemetery for a number of decades, and they were left undisturbed. But people did know where the remains were buried, and some even toured the cemetery to pay their respects. But in 1814, King Louis XVIII ordered an investigation into the possibility of digging up Marie Antoinette and her husband, Louis XVI's body, and remains so they could be given a proper and decent burial. It was hoped that the pair would be buried inside of the royal mausoleum. Louis XVI's body was found on the 18th of January 1815, and Marie's body was also found very easily. What the grave diggers discovered was quite remarkable. A layer of quicklime had been poured onto the coffin of Marie, and it had preserved her remains as it solidified. They found her remains were wearing the stockings that she was given in prison, and these were recorded in accounts at the time as Marie wearing them on the way to her execution. These stockings confirmed that this was Marie's coffin, and many then prayed at her gravesite. There was also confirmation that the Queen had lost her head, as the body clearly showed that she had been decapitated by a sharp instrument that performed a clean cut. Also parts of her hair were found on her head, and then the remains of Marie were placed inside a new coffin and a chest. Anything else found in the coffin was also collected, and then preparations were made to inter her in a proper burial site befitting her status. The decision was that she and her husband would be buried inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, and it was said of the ceremony and the reburial of the Queen that a detachment of artillery joined the procession at the barrier St. Denis and followed it, firing minute guns. A regiment of the King's chasseurs lined the road from Paris to St. Denis. The drums and musical instruments were covered with black serge, and the arms and colours of the troops were ornamented with crape. A deep and solemn silence prevailed among the multitudes who thronged the streets and roads by which the procession passed. Upon reaching the church of St. Denis, the bodies were taken from the cart by the guards de la Marche and carried into the church, where they were received by the clergy and presented by the Bishop of Carsacone to the Bishop of Ars. They were then placed upon a lofty tomb of slate in the midst of the choir. Monsieur, after retiring for a few minutes, entered the church and was followed by the Duke of Angoulême, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orléans, and the Prince de Conde, who occupied the stalls on the right nearest the altar. The Duchess of Orléans, the Duchess of Bourbon, and Mademoiselle of Orléans entered the opposite stalls. Next to the prince sat the Duke of Dalmatia, the Duke of Reggio, Count Bartholomew, and Emmeline, whom the king had appointed to support the pile when the coffins were carried to the vault. The other stalls were occupied by deputations from the Court of Cassation, the Court of Accompts, the councils of the University, and the Cour Royale, the municipality, the Tribunal de Première Instance. The choir was filled by the great officers of the king's household, the officers of the prince's household, his majesty's ministers, the high personages appointed to form part of the procession, the marshals and peers of France, the deputies of the departments, the grand crosses of the order of the Major General and staff of the National Guards, the governor of the 1st Military Division and his staff, and a great number of generals and other military officers. The governess of the royal children, the ladies-in-waiting upon her late Majesty, and the ladies-in-waiting upon the Duchess of Angoulême sat upon benches near the coffins. 400 young ladies of the Maison Royale de la St. Denis were seated in front of the altar. When all these attendants had taken their places, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, and into which Monsieur and the 2 princes, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service at St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. To perpetuate the memory of those august victims, the King has ordained that solemn funeral services shall be performed annually in all the churches of the kingdom on the 21st of January for the repose of the souls of Louis XVI, and on the 16th of October for that of his royal consort, and that on those days the court shall wear mourning, and the public offices, courts of justice, exchange, and theatres be closed. When the gravediggers discovered the remains of Marie Antoinette, they were amazed, and to many following this brief restoration of the monarchy, she was a martyr and a victim of the French Revolution. Still today, her remains are buried inside of the Royal Mausoleum, and she is considered a very controversial lady in history. But the discovery of her coffin and the subsequent opening of this was a monumentous moment in European history. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.